What if everything you thought you knew about this story was wrong? What if the woman everyone called a victim was never a victim at all? And what if the cowboy everyone called a hero was riding into that town with orders to destroy her? I want you to hold that thought. I want it to sit right in the middle of your chest like a hot coal. Because by the end of this video, it is going to ignite into something you did not see coming. Not even close. Welcome back to God of the West, the channel where we do not sanitize history, we do not romanticize suffering, and we do not let the dead be forgotten. I am your host, and today we are telling the story of a woman named Sarah May Calloway, a drifter named Silas Crane, and a conspiracy so deep and so dark that it reached all the way from the cracked red earth of the Arizona Territory Strait into the halls of the United States Congress. This is not a love story, though love is in it. This is not a revenge story, though revenge moves through every chapter of it like a river that refuses to change its course. This is a story about identity, about what happens when the world decides to erase a person completely, to take their name from official records, to burn the documents that prove they exist, to scatter the people who love them like seeds on infertile ground, and about what happens when that person refuses to disappear. Stay with me. Every single minute of this video matters. Every single detail I am about to give you is a piece of a puzzle. And I promise you, when the final piece falls into place in the last moments of this story, your jaw will drop. I have told many stories on this channel. I have never told one quite like this. And I need you to understand something before we begin. This story is true. The names are real. The injustice was real. And the ending that nobody saw coming. That was the most real thing of all. The year is 1874. The Arizona Territory is a place that God made beautiful and men made brutal. Saguaro cactus stands along the ridgelines like silent sentinels watching over a land that has known more bloodshed than rainfall. And the sky above it at sunset turns the color of a wound healing. Red and orange, and a deep, bruised purple that makes you feel something you cannot quite name. It is into this landscape that Sarah May Calloway was born 24 years before our story begins, in a homestead 12 miles southeast of a town called Duskwater. Her father was a man named Jedediah Calloway, Jed to everyone who knew him, a former surveyor from Virginia who came west after the war with nothing but a compass, a Bible, and a legal land grant signed by the territorial governor himself. That land grant was everything. It was 40 acres of earth that Jed Calloway had earned through 3 years of survey work for the territorial government, mapping trails that other men would ride to glory while Jed himself disappeared back into the dust. He had walked every inch of those 40 acres before he built his first fence post. He had pressed his palms flat against the ground and felt something move through him that he would later describe to his daughter as the feeling of belonging. Not ownership, belonging. There is a difference, and Jed Calloway understood it, which tells you everything you need to know about the kind of man he was. Sarah's mother, Abigail Calloway, née Forsyth, was a woman of remarkable composure. She had come from a prosperous Georgia family that had been reduced to ash and memory by the war, and she had arrived in Arizona with the particular kind of toughness that only total loss can forge. Not the brittle toughness of someone who has never been broken, but the flexible, resilient toughness of someone who has been broken completely and learned to grow back stronger in the cracks. Abigail taught Sarah to read before she was 4 years old. She taught her arithmetic with stones and sticks in the dirt. She taught her to identify every plant within 20 miles of their homestead by sight and smell, including which ones could heal and which ones could kill. She taught her, crucially, to never sign anything without reading it 3 times. That lesson would matter more than any of the others. Sarah grew up in a household that was poor in money and rich in everything else. In books, in conversation, in the quiet dignity that comes from people who know exactly who they are. She was, by every account of those who knew her in those years, extraordinary. Not in the way that stories sometimes manufacture extraordinary women by stripping them of their flaws and their complications, but extraordinary in the real way. The way that means complex, contradictory, sometimes maddening, always surprising. She was fiercely intelligent and occasionally arrogant about it. She was generous to people she loved and cold as Winter Creek water to people she did not. She could spend 3 hours reading a legal document with the focused patience of a scholar, and then spend the next 20 minutes trying to ride a horse bareback across a creek on a dare. She was, in other words, fully human. In the world she lived in had very little patience for fully human women, particularly fully human women who refused to be quiet. The trouble with Sarah May Calloway, the thing that made her dangerous to certain men in certain rooms, was not that she was reckless. It was that she was not reckless at all. It was that she was precise. It was that she remembered everything. It was that she had read, at the age of 17, the complete legal statutes governing land ownership in the Arizona Territory, not because anyone told her to, but because she was curious and because the law fascinated her. The way a river fascinates you when you cannot yet swim, something powerful and potentially deadly that you cannot help but want to understand. She had read those statutes, and she had found something in them that nobody, not her father, not the neighbors, not the men who ran the territorial land office, had apparently thought to look for. She had found a provision, a specific, narrow, almost invisible provision buried in the Third Amendment to the Territorial Land Act of 1862 that governed what happened to a land grant when the original grantee died without a will. The provision was obscure. The provision was overlooked by almost everyone. The provision, however, was the law, and what it said, what it clearly, unambiguously said, was that in the Arizona Territory, a land grant passed in full and without encumbrance to the eldest surviving child of the grantee, regardless of that child's sex. Not to the government, not to a bank, not to a trust or a corporation or a judge's pocket. To the child. Sarah had found this provision, memorized it, written it down in the small leather-bound journal she kept hidden under the floorboards of her bedroom, and then set it aside because at the time it did not seem relevant. Her father was alive. Her father was healthy. Her father had another 30 or 40 years in him, God willing, and the provision was a footnote in a future so distant it might as well have been a different country. She was 17. She had other things to think about. She set it aside. She should not have set it aside, because 3 years later, in the spring of 1874, Jedediah Calloway was thrown from his horse during a flash flood and broke his neck on a rock in Copperwash Creek. And he died before sundown with his daughter's hand in his, and the sound of the water still rushing past him like the world did not notice or care. He left no will. He had never written one. He was 41 years old, which is what the frontier did to men. It made them feel invincible right up until the moment it didn't. And the provision Sarah had read at 17 years old suddenly became the most important piece of legal text in the Arizona Territory. Or it should have been. It should have been if the men who ran Duskwater and the Land Office and the newly formed Territorial Development Corporation had not already made other plans for Jed Calloway's 40 acres. Plans that had nothing to do with what the law said. Plans that had everything to do with what the railroad wanted. I want to stop here for just a moment because I need you to feel something. I need you to understand what it means to be Sarah May Calloway in the weeks after her father's death. Her mother, Abigail, is grief-broken, but functioning. That particular frontier woman kind of functioning where you keep moving because stopping means dying, where you bake bread in the morning even though your hands are shaking, where you sweep the porch even though you're crying. Sarah is burying her father and simultaneously trying to figure out who inherits what and how quickly she can establish her legal claim before the vultures arrive. And the vultures always arrive. In the Arizona Territory in 1874, the lead vulture was a man named Colonel Beaumont Hatch. I want you to remember that name. I want it to burn into your memory the way it burned into Sarah's, because Colonel Beaumont Hatch is not just the villain of this story. He is a symbol of an entire system, a man who had leveraged the chaos and corruption of frontier governance to build a personal empire out of other people's pain. Hatch was not a real colonel. The title was honorary, bestowed by a territorial governor who owed him money, and Hatch wore the way all fake titles are worn, constantly, aggressively, as though the frequency of its use could manufacture the legitimacy of life. He was 53 years old, physically imposing. With a gray beard he kept trimmed to military precision and eyes the color of February sky. Pale, flat, utterly without warmth. He had made his fortune in land. Specifically, he had made his fortune in taking land from people who could not protect themselves, and the method he had perfected over 20 years of practice was elegant in its brutality. He did not steal. He fabricated. He would manufacture legal ambiguities, create false documentation, bribe territorial clerks to alter records, and then deploy his personal attorney, a man named Mr. Aldous Prine, who was either the best or worst lawyer in Arizona, depending on which side of the courtroom you were standing on, to present these fabrications before a territorial judge who happened to hatch a great deal of money and favors. By the time Jed Calloway's body was in the ground, Hatch had already filed a claim asserting that the 40 acres of Calloway homestead land were encumbered by a debt that Jed Calloway had allegedly incurred with the Territorial Development Corporation, a debt for which there was a promissory note bearing what appeared to be Jed Calloway's signature. The note was a forgery. Sarah knew it was a forgery the moment she saw it, because Jed Calloway had taught her his signature when she was 6 years old as a game, tracing it over and over on scraps of paper, and she knew every loop and line of the way you know the face of someone you love. The forgery was close. It was very close, but it was not exact. And Sarah Calloway had a memory like a steel trap and a journal under her floorboards with a legal provision that could have made the entire fraudulent debt claim irrelevant anyway. She should have won immediately. She should have walked into the land office, presented her evidence, cited the provision, and walked out with title to her family's land. Here's why she did not. Here is the part that will make your blood go cold. 3 days after Jed Calloway's death, while Sarah was still sitting with her grief, 2 men rode to the Calloway homestead with a document from the Territorial Land Office. The document stated that the land grant originally issued to Jedediah Calloway had been administratively voided due to a surveying error discovered upon routine review. The 40 acres were hereby returned to territorial jurisdiction pending reassignment. Sarah read the document. She read it 3 times, the way her mother had taught her, and then she said very calmly that she needed to see the underlying survey records that identified the alleged error, and she needed the document to be signed by the land office director rather than a deputy clerk, and she would be in town within 48 hours to examine the records in person. The 2 men looked at her, this 24-year-old woman standing in her doorway with dirt still on her dress from helping dig her father's grave. And one of them said, with the particular contempt that certain men reserve for women who ask inconvenient questions, "Ma'am, this ain't a negotiation." Sarah said, "No, it is a legal process, and I know the difference." They left. She immediately began writing letters to the territorial governor's office, to the federal land commissioner in Washington, to 2 attorneys in Tucson whose names she had found in her father's correspondence. She was methodical. She was precise. She was working within the system because she believed, with the particular faith of someone who has studied the law extensively, that the system could be made to work if you knew how to operate it correctly. She was about to learn something that no legal textbook had ever taught her. She was about to learn that a system only works for the people it was designed to protect. Within 2 weeks, 3 things happened that stripped Sarah May Calloway of the tools she needed to fight. First, the Territorial Land Office reported that the records she had requested for review had been damaged in a fire that had, conveniently, destroyed only the documents relevant to the Calloway land grant and nothing else. Second, the 2 attorneys she had written to in Tucson both sent her letters declining to take her case. One of them cited a conflict of interest without elaboration. The other one simply did not explain. She would discover later, much later, that both men had received visits from associates of Colonel Hatch within days of receiving her letters. Third, and most devastating, the journal. The leather-bound journal Sarah kept under her floorboards. The one with the legal provision written out in her careful handwriting. The one with notes dating back 7 years. The one that contained her record of the forged signature and her analysis of the fraudulent debt claim. It was gone. The floorboards had been pried up and replaced so carefully that she almost missed it. Almost. Someone had been in her home. Someone had known exactly where to look. And someone had taken the single most important piece of documentation she possessed. Sarah sat down on the floor of her bedroom. The bedroom where she had slept her whole life. The bedroom where her mother had nursed her through fever and read to her, during thunderstorms, and she sat there for a long time without moving. I want you to understand what this moment felt like. Imagine spending years building something, not a physical thing, but a mental thing, an architecture of knowledge and preparation and careful thought, and then having it taken from you not by force, but by stealth, by someone who understood exactly how to hurt you most efficiently. The land was one thing. Land could be recovered, but the journal represented Sarah's mind, made physical, her preparation made real, and taking it was not just theft. It was a message. The message was, we see you, we know how you think, and we are always 3 steps ahead. Most people would have broken at that point. Most people, and I say this without judgment because the weight of what Sarah was carrying was genuinely crushing, would have accepted the reality that the forces arrayed against them were simply too powerful, that the corruption was too deep, that resistance was futile. Most people would have taken their grieving mother and their few remaining possessions and found somewhere else to go. Sarah Mae Calloway was not most people. What the theft of her journal did was not break her. What it did was clarify her completely, because it told her something she had not fully understood before. These men were afraid of her. You do not steal a woman's private journal in the middle of the night if you are not afraid of what she knows. You do not commit a crime to cover a crime unless the first crime is one you cannot afford to have exposed. They had made a mistake in taking that journal. They had revealed the depth of their desperation. And Sarah, sitting on that floor in the house that was being stolen from under her, recognized the mistake and filed it away in the only place they could not reach, her memory. She did not write anything down again for a very long time. Everything she knew, everything she planned, everything she discovered from that moment forward, she kept inside her head, where no one could steal it. What happened next? However, what happened over the following 3 months, even Sarah's extraordinary mind could not have predicted, because the Territorial Development Corporation was not finished. Taking the land was not sufficient. Taking the journal was not sufficient. What Colonel Beaumont Hatch wanted, what he had always wanted, though Sarah did not yet understand the full scope of it, was to ensure that there was no Sarah Mae Calloway at all. I need you to stop for a moment. I need you to breathe. Because what I'm about to tell you is the part of this story that, when I first researched it, made me sit back from my desk and stare at the wall for a solid minute before I could continue. What Hatch and Prine did next was not merely illegal. What they did was, in its way, a kind of philosophical murder. A murder of identity. A murder of existence. Here is what they did. Over the course of 3 months in the summer of 1874, through a series of coordinated actions involving bribed clerks at 3 different government offices, they systematically altered or destroyed every official record that proved Sarah Mae Calloway existed. The birth record filed by Jedediah Calloway at the Territorial Record Office in 1850. Gone. Replaced with a record showing that the child born to Jedediah and Abigail Calloway that year had died at 2 months of age from fever. The marriage record of Jedediah and Abigail Calloway. Amended. Abigail's surname changed in the record from Forsyth to a name that matched no living person, effectively making her a legal ghost. The land grant deed itself, the original document signed by the territorial governor, reported as lost in the same fire that had destroyed the survey records. And most diabolically, an affidavit filed with the court of the territorial judge who was in Hatch's pocket, attesting that the woman currently residing on the Calloway homestead and claiming to be Jedediah Calloway's daughter was in fact an itinerant woman of no known origin who had moved onto the property after Calloway's death and was squatting illegally on land that now legally belonged to the Territorial Development Corporation. On paper, in the official record of the Arizona Territory, Sarah Mae Calloway did not exist. She had no name. She had no history. She had no legal standing to claim anything, because legally speaking, she was not the daughter of anyone at all. She was a woman without a past, which in 1874 meant she was a woman without a future. She and her mother were given a final notice of eviction, this time delivered not by clerks, but by 4 armed men who worked for Hatch and who made very clear that the notice was not a bequest. They had 36 hours. They took what they could carry. Abigail Calloway, who had survived the destruction of one life in Georgia and rebuilt in Arizona, looked at her homestead for the last time with the particular expression of someone who is placing something very carefully in a vault inside themselves. Not destroying it, not releasing it, simply protecting it from further damage. She put her arm around her daughter's shoulders, and she said, "They took everything they could see. They cannot take what they cannot see." She was talking about Sarah's memory. She was talking about what Sarah carried inside herself. And she was right. But here's the question that nobody was asking in those 36 hours. The question that Sarah was already asking, because Sarah was always asking the question that nobody else was asking yet. Who told them about the journal? Someone had known it was there. Someone had known what was in it. Someone who had been close enough, trusted enough, to know where Sarah kept her most private documentation. Sarah had one suspect. One, a man she had trusted. A man she had believed was an ally. A man whose name, when she finally confirmed his betrayal, would crack something open in her that took a very long time to close back up. But that is a piece of the story we will come back to. Because right now, I need to introduce you to a man who was riding into Duskwater from the opposite direction, carrying wounds of his own that had nothing to do with Sarah Calloway and everything to do with Colonel Beaumont Hatch. His name was Silas Crane. If you had seen him riding into Duskwater on that October morning in 1874, you would not have looked at him twice. That was intentional. Silas Crane had spent the better part of 12 years cultivating the particular art of being someone that nobody remembered seeing. The kind of man who ordered a whiskey at the bar and sat in the corner and listened to everything without appearing to listen to anything. The kind of man whose face your memory slightly blurred even as he was standing directly in front of you. He was 37 years old, lean in the way that people who rarely eat enough are lean, with dark hair going gray at the temples and a jaw that looked like it had been hit more times than it deserved. He rode a gray horse named Patience, which told you something about him. That he was the kind of man who named horses, and that he named them after things he was still learning. He came into Duskwater with $3 in his pocket and a letter that had been delivered to him 6 weeks prior at a boarding house in El Paso. And the letter had sent him north with the particular urgency of a man who has a debt to pay and does not rest easy until it is settled. Here is what you need to understand about Silas Crane before we go any further. Here is the thing that changes everything about how you read the next part of this story. Silas Crane worked for Colonel Beaumont Hatch. He had worked for Hatch twice before, 2 previous assignments in 2 previous territories, assignments that he had completed and been paid for without asking too many questions. Because asking too many questions was not something you did when you worked for Beaumont Hatch, and you wanted to keep breathing. The assignments had been simple. Locate a specific individual, keep watch on their movements, report back. He had told himself they were surveillance jobs. He had told himself he was not responsible for what Hatch did with the information. He had told himself a great many things, and in the small hours of the night when sleep would not come, he knew every single one of them was a lie he was telling himself to avoid looking at what he had actually been participating in. The letter from Hatch's attorney, Aldous Prine, had laid out the new assignment with the same clinical brevity as the previous ones. There was a woman in Duskwater. A squatter, Prine called her. She had become a nuisance. She was making inquiries, talking to people, asking questions about the Territorial Development Corporation and its land acquisition practices. She needed to be watched. Her movements needed to be documented. If she made contact with anyone of significance, attorneys, federal officials, newspapermen, Silas was to report it immediately and, if the situation required intervention, to ensure it was handled discreetly. Silas had read the letter. He had read it 3 times. Not because he missed anything on the first read. He hadn't. But because he was giving himself 3 chances to put the letter down and walk away. He had not walked away. Not because he needed the money, though he did. Not because he was afraid of Hatch, though any sensible man would be. He had taken the assignment because of something at the bottom of the letter. A single line that Prine had added almost as an afterthought. A line that made Silas's hand tighten on the paper until it crinkled. The subject's surname is Calloway. Her father was Jedediah Calloway, formerly of the Territorial Survey Office. Jedediah Calloway. Silas had known that name for 12 years. Jed Calloway had been the surveyor who charted the trail that Silas and his partner, a man named Walt Briggs, had ridden through in the winter of 1862 when they were coming back from a failed mining venture and were lost and running out of water. Jed Calloway had found them, two half-dead strangers in the desert, and had taken them to his camp and fed them and pointed them toward water and sent them on their way. It was not a dramatic rescue. Jed had not made a speech about it. He had simply done it the way you do things that are clearly right, without calculation, without expectation of reward, without ceremony. Walt Briggs had died the following year of a fever, but Silas had never forgotten Jedediah Calloway's face or the matter-of-fact decency of what he had done. And now Jed Calloway was dead, and his daughter was being hunted, and Silas Crane was the man Beaumont Hatch had sent to hunt her. He rode into Duskwater and took a room at the boarding house and sat on the edge of his narrow bed for a long time, staring at the wall. And what he was deciding in the silence of that was the most important decision he would ever make in his life. Though he did not know that yet, he found her, or rather she found him, on his third day in Duskwater, which was faster than he expected and a good deal faster than she was supposed to know he existed. He was drinking coffee at the counter of the Duskwater dry goods store, going through the motions of a man looking for work, when he felt someone sit down beside him with a particular kind of deliberateness, not casual, not accidental, but chosen. He looked up. Sarah May Calloway, or the woman the official record now insisted did not exist, was looking at him with eyes the color of dark river water, and those eyes contained an expression that he recognized from his mirror. The expression of someone who has gone past fear into something quieter and more dangerous. "You have been watching me," she said. Not question. A statement of fact offered without accusation, in the tone of someone citing observed evidence. Silas opened his mouth to deny it, and she said, before he could speak, "Do not lie to me. I have had enough of that to last several lifetimes. Tell me instead who sent you and what they want, and I will tell you something in return that will change every calculation you have made in the last 3 days." He looked at her for a long moment. He said, "How did you know?" She said, "Because you are the third man Hatch has sent to watch me, and the first two were amateurs. You're not an amateur, but you have been watching me too carefully. A man looking for work watches potential employers. You were watching me." He said nothing. She said, "I know about Aldous Prime. I know about the Territorial Development Corporation. I know about the land fraud, and I know about the record alteration, and I know..." And here she stopped for just a fraction of a second, the briefest possible falter, the only visible sign of the weight she was carrying. "I know that according to every official document in this territory, I no longer exist, which means I have nothing left to lose." Silas Crane put down his coffee cup. He said, "What is it you think you can tell me?" And Sarah said, "I can tell you why Beaumont Hatch is really afraid of me. And I promise you, it is not because of 40 acres of homestead land." That was the moment. That was the specific crack of light in the door. Because Silas Crane had wondered since he read Prine's letter, why a man as powerful and calculating as Beaumont Hatch would expend this much effort on a single woman with no resources and no legal standing. The 40 acres were valuable, yes. The railroad route made them very valuable. But Hatch had taken dozens of properties through similar methods and had never sent personal operatives to watch a grieving woman who had already been evicted. There was something else. Sarah knew what it was, and she told him. What Sarah told Silas Crane in that dry goods store, in a voice kept deliberately level and quiet, took 22 minutes. She had been carrying the information alone for months, protecting it the way you protect a flame in a windstorm, with your whole body curved around it, your whole self committed to keeping it alive. She told it without notes, without documentation, purely from memory, and the precision with which she laid it out, date by date, document by document, name by name, made Silas Crane understand two things simultaneously. First, this woman was the most formidable person he had encountered in 37 years ago. Second, Beaumont Hatch was in very serious trouble. Here is what Sarah had discovered in the weeks between losing her journal and arriving in Duskwater with nothing but what she carried in her head. Jedediah Calloway had not merely been a territorial surveyor. 20 years before the events of our story, in 1854, Jed Calloway had been part of a federal survey team commissioned directly by the United States Congress to establish official land boundaries across the Arizona and New Mexico territories. In the course of that survey, Calloway and his team had documented and recorded the location of the original Spanish land grants. Vast tracts of land, some of them hundreds of thousands of acres, that predated American territorial governance and were legally protected under the terms of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo signed in 1848. These grants had a peculiar legal status. They were recognized by federal law as superior to any subsequent territorial claim or development corporation filing. They cannot be legally encumbered by debt. They could not be voided by administrative action. And critically, they passed in full to the documented heir of the original grantee. Jed Calloway had documented one such grant in particular, grant number 14 in the Federal Survey record, with meticulous precision. And he had done something unusual with that documentation. He had, for reasons that Sarah had only partially worked out, included in the official survey record a notation that linked grant number 14 to a specific individual as the documented heir. The notation was in survey code, a system of alphanumeric markers that only a trained surveyor would understand. Sarah had learned the code from her father as a child, the way she had learned everything from him, as a game, as a curiosity, as a way of spending time together that was also quietly, lovingly educational. She had never expected to use it. She had never expected to need it. The notation in the survey record, the Federal Survey record, housed in Washington, D.C., and therefore beyond the reach of Beaumont Hatch's local network of bribed clerks, identified the heir of grant number 14. And the heir was not some distant Spanish aristocrat. The heir was not a corporation or a bank or a government agency. The heir, according to Jedediah Calloway's own careful notation in a record that had been sitting untouched in the National Archives for 20 years, was Abigail Forsyth Calloway, Sarah's mother, which meant that upon Abigail's death, or upon Abigail's formal assignment of her rights, the grant would pass to Abigail's eldest child, to Sarah May Calloway. Grant number 14 was not 40 acres of homestead land. Grant number 14 was 470,000 acres of Arizona territory, land that included every inch of ground that the railroad needed for its expansion, land that made the Calloway homestead look like a postage stamp, land that would make Sarah May Calloway, if she could prove her identity and her lineage in a federal court, one of the largest landholders in the history of the American Southwest. This was why Beaumont Hatch had destroyed her records. This was why he had taken her journal. This was why he had sent men to watch her. He had found the notation. He or someone working for him had decoded it. He knew what the federal grant meant. He knew that if Sarah ever discovered it, if Sarah ever found out that her mother held a claim that trumped every land acquisition he had ever made, his entire empire came apart at the seams. He was not trying to steal 40 acres from a grieving woman. He was trying to destroy the one person who could legally take everything from him. Silas Crane sat with this information for exactly 4 minutes. Sarah counted them, watching his face, watching him process what she had said, watching the precise moment when he crossed from the man Hatch had paid to the man he had been before Hatch's money had started to define him. She saw it. The shift was small, a straightening of the shoulders, a particular settling of the jaw. But she had grown up watching her father make difficult decisions, and she knew what one looked like from the outside. He said, "You need to get to a federal court, not territorial. Federal." She said, "I know." He said, "You need the survey record, the original notation, in Washington." She said, "I know." He said, "Hatch is a man inside the telegraph office. Everything you send can be intercepted." She said, "I know that too." He looked at her. "Then what do you need from me?" And she said, "I need someone who knows how Hatch operates. Someone who knows his routes, his contacts, his timing. Someone who can help me get a physical letter to a federal official without it being intercepted. I know you work for him. That means you know things I need to know. I'm asking you to help me, knowing that I have nothing to offer you in return except the truth and the knowledge that what you would be doing is right." There was a silence between them that was not empty. It was a silence full of everything that was not being said, the weight of what Silas had participated in, knowing and not knowing. The cost of what Sarah was asking him to risk. The particular seriousness of a decision that could not be unmade. Silas said, "Hatch is going to know I switched sides the moment we move." Sarah said, "Yes." He said, "He will send men." She said, "He already has men here." He said, "More men, better men." She said, "I know." Another silence. Then Silas Crane reached into his coat and pulled out the letter from Aldous Prine. The letter assigning him to watch Sarah Calloway. The letter that documented his employment by the Territorial Development Corporation, and he placed it flat on the counter between them. He said, "This letter is evidence. It documents that Hatch sent an operative to conduct surveillance on you. It is not much, but in a federal court, it is a great deal." Sarah looked at the letter. She looked at it. She said, "You are going to use this." He said, "I was thinking about it." She said, "Why didn't you?" He said, "Because I didn't know yet if you were who you seemed to be." She said, "And now?" He said, picking up his coffee cup, finishing the last cold swallow. "Now, I think you are considerably more than you seem to be. Which means we need to leave Duskwater today, before sundown." They left Duskwater in the mid-afternoon. Sarah on a roan mare she had borrowed from the only person in town she still trusted, a Tohono O'odham woman named Rosa, who ran the laundry, had been quietly providing Sarah with food and shelter since the eviction, asking nothing and saying little, an act of solidarity so consistent and so quiet that Sarah would spend the rest of her life trying to find adequate words to honor it. They rode north and then east toward the territory's edge, toward the jurisdiction of federal law. And Beaumont Hatch's men came after them before they had been riding 3 hours. 4 riders. Good ones. Silas saw them first. The way you see things you know the shape of. And he told Sarah without turning his head, keeping his voice entirely flat and his posture entirely relaxed, so that nothing in his body language would signal to a distant observer that he had seen anything. She said, "How far?" He said, 2 miles. Maybe less. They are moving fast. She said, "Can we outride them?" He said, "No. Your mare is good, but patience is tired. We cannot win a straight race." She said, "Then we do not run a straight race." What happened in the next 90 minutes in the canyon country east of Duskwater was later described by Silas Crane in his written account as the most efficient demonstration of terrain thinking I have ever witnessed from any person, trained or otherwise. Sarah knew that country. She had ridden it her whole life, had ridden it with her father during surveys, had ridden it alone in the years when solitude was her only reliable companion. She knew where the canyon walls narrowed to the point where 4 riders became 2 riders became 1 rider. She knew where the rock floor gave way to loose shale that made tracking nearly impossible. She knew a particular overhang that cast such complete shadow in the afternoon light that a person sheltering beneath it was essentially invisible from 40 yards away. She led them through it all with a certainty that brooked no hesitation, no second-guessing, no deviation in Silas Crane, who had been leading people through difficult country for 20 years, followed her without question, because following without question was what you did when you recognized that the person in front of you knew more than you did. They lost the riders in the canyon. Not permanently. Hatch's men were good, but long enough to reach the relay station at Red Mesa Crossing before dark. Long enough for Silas to call in a debt from the relay man there, a former colleague who owed him a favor of the kind that does not expire, and secure fresh horses and a 4-hour head start. They rode through the night. Sarah did not sleep. She recited, softly, continuously, the details of everything she needed to remember. Dates, names, record numbers, the specific alphanumeric code from her father's survey notation. Like a prayer, like a song, like someone tending a fire that absolutely cannot be allowed to go out. Silas listened. He did not interrupt. He understood what she was doing, and he understood why. And somewhere in the small, dark hours of that ride, he understood something else. Something that had been forming at the edge of his consciousness since the dry goods store and had now resolved into a clarity he could not avoid. He had been on the wrong side of things for a long time. Not because he was an evil man. Not because he had chosen evil. But because he had chosen convenience over conscience. One small compromise at a time. until the distance between where he was and where he wanted to be had become something he was no longer sure he could cross. And then Jed Calloway's daughter had sat down next to him and forced him across it. They reached the federal marshal's office in Tucson at dawn, 2 days after leaving Duskwater. Sarah was gray with exhaustion. Silas had a crease along his left arm from a bullet that had found him during a brief, sharp encounter with 2 of Hatch's riders at a water crossing 40 miles back. Not serious, but bleeding steadily through the cloth he had pressed against it. A reminder that the physical reality of what they were doing was not abstract. The federal marshal's name was Joseph Allgate. He was a man who had been in his position for 11 years and had achieved something rare in the Arizona territory. He was genuinely incorruptible, not because he was particularly righteous, but because he was particular about the law, particular about procedure, particular about the difference between what was technically legal and what was actually just. He had been waiting, in a sense, for a case like this one. Not this specific case, but a case that required the kind of careful, patient, document-by-document dismantling of a corrupt system that most people lacked either the evidence or the will to pursue. Sarah laid it all out for him. Everything. Every piece of it. From the forged promissory note, to the destroyed records, to the federal survey notation, to the specific provisions of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo that protected the Spanish land grants. She laid it out in order, without notes, without hesitation, without a single moment where the thread lost coherence or the logic broke down. Joseph Allgate listened. He asked 3 questions, 3 careful, precise questions that told her he had understood everything she said and was already thinking 3 moves ahead. Then he turned to Silas Crane and said, "You have the prime letter?" Silas put on the desk. Allgate looked at it for a long moment. Then he said, "I'm going to need you both to give formal depositions. This is going to take some time. The evidence in Washington will take longer to obtain officially. Hatch will not be arrested today. He may not be arrested for weeks." Sarah said, "I understand." Allgate said, "In the interim, he may attempt to," Sarah said. "I understand what he may attempt. I have been living with that understanding for 6 months." Allgate looked at her with the particular expression of a man who has spent his career dealing with the aftermath of what powerful men do to vulnerable people and who has learned, very precisely, the difference between a victim and a witness. He said, "Miss Calloway, I want to be clear about something. This case, if it proceeds the way I believe it can proceed, will not result in you receiving 40 acres. It will result in you receiving what is legally yours, which is considerably more than 40 acres. Sarah said nothing. She simply looked at him, and Allgate said, "Are you prepared for that?" And she said, "Marshal, I was prepared for this since I was 17 years old. I just did not know it yet." What happened next is the part of this story that historians have puzzled over for decades. What happened next is the reason I told you, at the very beginning of this video, that everything you thought you knew about this story was wrong. Here is the surprise. Here is the thing that nobody, not Hatch, not Prine, not the Marshal, not even Sarah herself, had fully accounted for. Silas Crane, in the days following their arrival in Tucson, provided Marshal Allgate with something beyond the prime letter, something that he had been carrying for years without fully understanding what it was. Silas Crane was, in the years before he began working for Beaumont Hatch, a courier. He had ridden for various enterprises across 3 territories, carrying documents and packages and letters for people who needed things delivered discreetly. In 1868, he had carried a sealed package for Aldous Prine himself, a package from Santa Fe to a land office in Prescott, a package he had delivered as instructed without opening. But Silas Crane, courier, had been a very careful man. And careful men, when they're transporting sealed packages for powerful people, sometimes make copies, not of the contents. He had not broken the seal, but of the external markings, the reference numbers, the recipient's full name and designation, the specific date and time of delivery. He had done this as personal insurance, the way a man who rides difficult country always keeps a backup. Not because he planned to use it, but because the frontier had taught him that information not preserved is information lost. The reference numbers on that 1868 package, cross-referenced against the federal land records that Allgate now had access to, revealed something extraordinary. They revealed that in 1868, 6 years before Hatch made his move on the Callaway homestead, Aldous Prine had already filed a preemptive legal action in a federal court in Santa Fe to challenge the validity of Grant Number 14. A challenge that had been quietly dismissed for procedural reasons and then buried so completely that no one had known for it. But buried challenges leave traces. And the trace of that 1868 filing was an acknowledgement, in Prine's own legal handwriting, signed before a federal notary, that Grant Number 14 was a valid and active Spanish land grant with a documented living heir. Prine himself had confirmed the grant's validity in 1868 when he tried to challenge it. He had confirmed that the heir was real, that the grant was real, that everything Sarah knew and had told the marshal was true, and he had confirmed it 6 years before anyone pretended the question had ever been asked. Beaumont Hatch had known about Sarah Callaway since 1868. He had been planning this, the record destruction, the identity erasure, all of it, for 6 years. And his own attorney's failed court filing was the proof. Aldous Prine was arrested in his office in Duskwater on a Tuesday morning before he had finished his breakfast. Colonel Beaumont Hatch was arrested the following Thursday at his estate outside Prescott. And the particular detail that journalists would later seize upon was that he was arrested while hosting a dinner party, that he was sitting at the head of a long table with 8 guests when federal marshals walked in, and that he attempted, for approximately 4 seconds, to pretend that nothing unusual was happening before the reality of his situation settled on him like a building falling. He was convicted in federal court 14 months later on 27 counts of land fraud, document falsification, bribery of government officials, and conspiracy. He served 11 years in a federal penitentiary. But here is the twist within the twist. Here is the piece of this story that I've been holding back. The piece that, when I tell it, will change everything about how you have understood Silas Crane from the moment you first heard his name. On the day that Beaumont Hatch was convicted, a document was unsealed in the federal court in Tucson. A document that had been filed under court seal at the beginning of the legal process before the trial by Marshal Allgate himself. The document was Silas Crane's true identification. Because Silas Crane was not a drifter. Silas Crane was not a hired hand. Silas Crane had not spent 12 years drifting from job to job, taking work from men like Hatch out of desperation or moral ambiguity. For the previous 4 years, Silas Crane had been an undercover operative for the United States Department of Justice. He had been placed in proximity to Beaumont Hatch for the express purpose of gathering evidence against him. He had taken Hatch's money. He had done Hatch's work. He had followed Hatch's orders, within limits, always ensuring that no direct harm came to the people he was nominally surveilling, because that was what undercover work required, and because he had believed every single day that the day would come when Hatch would overreach and the evidence would be sufficient. He had not known about Grant Number 14. He had not known that Sarah Callaway would walk into this story and detonate it from the inside. He had not known that the woman Prine, called a squatter and a nuisance, would turn out to be the single most legally significant private individual in the Arizona territory. But when she sat down next to him at that counter and told him in 22 minutes everything she knew, he had understood. Not just that she was right, not just that she was extraordinary. He had understood that everything he had been working toward for 4 years had just been handed to him by a woman who had spent 6 months alone with nothing but her memory, doing the same work he had been doing with federal resources and legal cover. He had shown her the Prine letter not as a calculated move. He had shown it to her because it was the right thing to do, the most right thing available to him in that specific moment. And Silas Crane, undercover operative for the Department of Justice, a former courier and man who named his horse patience because he was still learning, Silas Crane had decided, somewhere between El Paso and Duskwater, that doing the right thing was the only calculation worth making. The day after Hatch was convicted, Silas Crane rode out of Tucson alone. Sarah Callaway stood at the edge of town and watched him go. She had known by then who he was, what he was. She had been told by Allgate before the trial. She had sat with the knowledge and turned it over like a stone in her hand, examining every face of it. The manipulation, the revelation, the genuine courage of that moment in the dry goods store when he had put the letter on the counter and decided, whatever else he was and whatever role he was playing, to do something real. She called out to him as he wrote. She said his name. He stopped, turned in the saddle. She said, "You could have told me." He said, "Yes." She said, "Why didn't you?" And he said, and this is in the record, reported by 2 witnesses. He said, "Because you didn't need me to save you. You needed me to get out of the way." He turned and rode. She watched until he was out of sight. Then she turned back toward the town that was about to have to reckon with the fact that the woman they had erased now owned more of the Arizona territory than the territorial government itself. Her mother, Abigail, who had been brought safely to Tucson before the trial and had sat in the courtroom for every day of proceedings with a stillness and a dignity that made reporters describe her in terms usually reserved for monuments rather than people. Abigail came to stand beside her. They stood together, mother and daughter, watching the dust where Silas Crane had been. And Abigail said, "What will you do with it? With all of it?" Sarah thought about 40 acres. She thought about cracked earth and cactus, and her father pressing his palms flat against the ground and feeling something he called belonging rather than ownership. She thought about Rosa, who had given her food and shelter and asked nothing. She thought about the Tejano Owadam families whose own land had been taken so many times that the taking had become a kind of background noise of history, something everyone acknowledged, and no one stopped. She said the right thing, the most right thing available. And she did. The legal proceedings that followed Hatch's conviction and the federal recognition of Grant Number 14 took 4 years to conclude. At the end of those 4 years, Sarah May Calloway, whose name was now fully restored in every official record, whose existence was documented and verified and legally unassailable, signed over the rights to 340,000 acres of Grant Number 14 to a federal trust established for the benefit of the indigenous communities of the Arizona territory. She retained the homestead, the 40 acres where her father had pressed his palms against the earth and felt belonging. She rebuilt the house. She invited her mother to move back in. She put her books on shelves and her father's compass on the mantle, and she sat on the porch in the evenings and watched the Arizona sky turn that particular color that makes you feel something you cannot quite name. And she was home. I told you at the beginning of this video that everything you thought you knew about this story was wrong. I told you that the most dangerous thing in the Arizona territory was not a bullet or a blade or a marshal's badge. I was right about that. The most dangerous thing in the Arizona territory in 1874 was a woman with a perfect memory, a father who taught her to read the law, and the absolute refusal to accept the idea that a person could be erased by the people who were afraid of them. Sarah May Calloway lived to be 81 years old. She outlived Colonel Beaumont Hatch, who died in prison. She outlived Aldous Prine, who spent 8 years in a federal penitentiary and died 6 months after his release. She outlived Marshall Algate, who retired in 1891 and wrote his memoirs and devoted 3 chapters to what he called the most remarkable legal case of his career. She outlived her mother Abigail, who passed in 1889 at the age of 67 with her daughter's hand in hers and the sound of the Arizona wind coming through the open window. She never married. She never left the homestead for more than a few weeks at a time. She spent the last decades of her life corresponding with legal scholars and historians and the occasional journalist who came out to Duskwater to interview her and invariably left with the feeling that they had not asked nearly the right questions and would need to come back. She kept a journal again. Many journals. They are in the University of Arizona archive, and they are extraordinary, dense with observation and memory and legal analysis and the occasional passage of pure, unguarded feeling that makes you understand, reading it, that the composure she showed the world was real and hard-won and coexisted with a depth of feeling that she chose to express in ink rather than in the presence of people who might mistake emotion for weakness. The last journal entry, written 3 days before her death in 1931, is only 2 sentences long. It says, "I've been thinking about Silas Crane. I hope he found what he was learning to have." We do not know what happened to Silas Crane after he rode out of Tucson. The Department of Justice records are incomplete. There are 3 possible sightings: one in Colorado, one in Oregon, one in Mexico. None confirmed. He is one of the West's genuine mysteries, a man who spent his life trying to be invisible and succeeded completely in the end. But here is what I believe, sitting with this story the way I've sat with it through months of research and reflection. I believe Silas Crane found whatever he was looking for. I believe that a man who names his horse Patience because he is still learning is a man who has not given up on the possibility of arriving somewhere better. I believe that the moment he put that letter on the counter, the moment he stopped calculating and started choosing, was the moment he became, for the first time in a long time, someone he recognized. And I believe that Sarah Mae Calloway knew all of that when she watched him right away. That is the West I want to talk about on this channel. Not the myth, the reality. The people who were erased and refused to stay erased. The people who did the right thing not because it was safe or easy or certain, but because it was right and they had decided that was sufficient reason. The people who pressed their palms against the hard earth and felt belonging and fought with everything they had to protect the right to feel it. If this story moved you, if any part of it stayed with you, I want to hear about it in the comments. Tell me what hit you hardest. Tell me what surprised you. Tell me if you think Silas Crane was a hero or something more complicated than that. Because the most interesting answers are always the complicated ones. Subscribe to God of the West if you have not already, because we have more stories like this one. Stories that the textbooks forgot, stories that deserve to be told, stories about people who are fully human and fully extraordinary and fully real. Ring the bell, share this video, and I will see you on the next ride. God of the West out.